Busho again, and today I'm going to show you how to replace captive rotors on 1990 to 1997 Accords. These vehicles have what's called a hub-over-rotor design. This makes rotor replacement more difficult and time-consuming since the rotor is bolted behind the wheel hub. Most vehicles use the more common rotor-over-hub design where the rotor sits on the wheel studs in front of the hub. Honda came to their senses in 1998 and switched the Accord back to the easier-to-service rotor-over-hub design. The first thing you need to do is ensure that you can get the axle nut off. If you can't get the axle nut off, you can't do this job at all. The easiest way to get it off is when the wheel's still on the ground. Here's the axle nut. You'll notice it's staked in right there. Get a screwdriver in there and pry it out so that it's round like the rest of the nut. Don't try to force it. If you do, you'll just end up damaging the threads on the axle. You may be able to get away with not unstaking the nut if you use an impact, but it's not worth the risk for me, so I always unstake it. After you've unstaked the nut, 36mm socket on a 1/2-inch breaker bar. This won't provide enough torque to break this loose. So get a long 3/4 inch pipe. Slide the breaker bar into it, and that will give you added leverage. One thing to note here, when you're pressing down on this pipe, do it with an open hand only. That way if the breaker bar breaks, you don't smash your knuckles into the ground. I find a cheater bar about 6 feet long is adequate for breaking the axle nut loose. It's all about mechanical advantage. The longer the pipe, the more torque you can apply with less effort. I'll show you another method when the vehicle's fully off the ground. Now clearly, even with the parking brake on, if you try rotating the axle nut, the wheel's simply going to turn, so you have to hold the brakes. Obviously you can have a helper do this for you, or you could use another method. All you have to do is get a piece of scrap wood you have lying around, press the brake pedal, put it up against the seat, and slide the seat forward. One thing to note when doing this, make sure that the engine's running when you depress the brake pedal, that way the brake booster is assisting you. Otherwise, the pads may slip on the rotors and the wheels may actually turn when you're applying that massive amount of torque from your breaker bar. You'll notice how much further the brake pedal went down with the engine running. You can shut the engine off after the brake pedal is being held firmly in place. And now the wheel won't rotate and you can remove the axle nut manually without a problem. One thing to be aware of, don't leave the brake pedal pressed for any longer than necessary. You don't want to drain your battery. And obviously you have to release the brake pedal in order to remove the calipers later. But I'll be using an impact, so I have no need to apply the brakes. To make it easier to get at the axle nut, I'll take the wheel off first. And as usual, these wheels can be pretty stubborn, so I'm sure I've shown you this before. Put one of the nuts back on loosely. Go underneath and give it a kick. Now here's the stake portion of the axle nut I mentioned earlier. There are two methods that you can use. The first is obviously get a screwdriver, put it in there, and carefully pry it outward until it's round like the rest of the nut again. Be very careful, it's very easy to break such a small screwdriver. Another method is with this tool I have. You simply insert it like this. Tap it with a hammer, and it'll unstake the nut. And as you can see, it does it pretty quickly. Easy as that. And as you can see, the tool does a pretty good job getting this nut as close to round again as possible. You're never going to get it completely round again. You just have to get it up and out of that slot. And when you look at where that was staked in, you can see why. If you leave that staked down like that, what it's going to do is it's just going to tear up all these threads here on the axle, and you're going to have a serious problem. Another set of fasteners you want to loosen while the brakes are applied are these four here. Just going to loosen them, not remove them. Now it's time to remove the caliper. 17mm bolt. And that's what you want to feel. It should come out smoothly. See, there's a nice amount of grease on there. You want to get a rag, wipe that off, and we'll put more grease on there later. Now grab the caliper, flip it up, and then pull it back and off the other slide pin. And again, wipe down this pin here. You never want to let the caliper hang by the brake hose. As you can see here, I just took a bungee cord, looped it through the upper control arm, hooked it onto the coil spring, and hooked the other end to the caliper. Now you can remove the pads, they just pull out. You'll notice the pad on the inside has a piece of metal on it. Right here, that's the wear indicator. That's what makes that screeching noise when your pad material gets too low. This pad always goes on the inside, not the outside. Now we're going to remove the caliper bracket. Two 17mm fasteners, one here and one here. Since these, like the caliper bolts, tend to be stubborn, I'm going to take the easy route and use my impact. But don't be afraid to use a 1/2" drive socket and even a breaker bar, because these can get stuck on there. And my 3/8" impact doesn't have enough power to get these off. Okay, time for the 1/2". Take two. For the upper bolt, I had to get a flex joint. The impact due to tight quarters. That's two, and the bracket will just come off. If you're not using an impact and are having difficulty removing the bracket bolts, spray them with penetrating oil and let them sit for a while before trying to remove them manually. I'm just going to put the fasteners back in the bracket. So I don't lose them. Now remove the cotter pin on the lower ball joint castle nut. Bend the legs back as straight as possible. Then get a pair of diagonal cutters. Grab it on the other side. Just pull it out. Sometimes you can get them out in one piece, sometimes they'll fall apart. I was attempting to remove this cotter pin in one piece, but it didn't work out. Here's a quicker method to remove a stubborn cotter pin. If you're having a problem pulling a cotter pin out, just get the head of the pin out, grab it with a pair of pliers, and just bend it back and forth. Until it snaps like that. Just leverage it out like that. Nice and easy. Loosen the castle nut, 17 millimeter. Reinstall the nut loosely, as we're gonna have to separate the ball joint now. As you can see, the taper is still firmly attached to the lower control arm. Now, there are multiple ways to get the tapered portion of the ball joint to pop loose from the control arm. One method is to use a hammer, hit on the lower control arm. You want to hit on the lower control arm where the ball joint stud goes through. Another method is a special tool that you can use to separate this ball joint. Here's a look at that special tool. It's called a ball joint separator. You install the forked end between the ball joint stud and the top of the lower control arm. Then place the bottom on the end of the ball joint stud. When you tighten the forcing bolt, it pushes the stud through the control arm, breaking the taper. I'd also like to add, stay away from pickle forks. They tend to destroy the rubber boot that keeps the grease in the ball joint, which leads to premature failure. And the method that I like to use is just jack up the suspension as high as possible, put a piece of metal between these 2 points here, and then let the suspension down, which will force the joint apart. Now to make this work, you don't want the ball joint nut all the way off. Just leave it loosely threaded on, because you don't want the joint to separate completely when you pop it loose. You also don't want the nut on so far that there's not enough room for the joint to pop loose. The area you want to jack up from is not directly on the ball joint stud, but this area right here. That'll hold your jack. And you just want to jack the suspension up a bit. You don't want to actually lift the vehicle off the jack stands. As you can see here, the suspension's been significantly compressed. Now the trick here is to insert a piece of metal between the lower control arm and the knuckle that's just the right size. So I have this piece of steel here.
And when the suspension comes down and the geometry changes, it's going to pinch this piece of steel and it's going to pop the ball joint loose.
I goofed up and forgot to hit record when I did the driver's side, so here's the process again on the passenger side.
Insert your ratchet handle, or as I have, a piece of steel between the lower control arm and the ball joint, like so. And let the suspension down and you should hear a pop and the ball joint breaks loose. And there it is. Now if it doesn't break loose when you let it down, that sometimes can happen, just put your feet on the nose of the rotor and step down onto it. That can pop it loose. If it still doesn't pop loose, that means that the piece of metal you have between the ball joint and lower control arm isn't thick enough, so you have to get something a little bit thicker. Now you could remove the lower ball joint castle nut and your bar.
Lift the knuckle out of the lower control arm.
And then you can turn the knuckle and pull out the axle. Now you want to turn the whole assembly to the side so you have access to the bearing bolts here, but one thing to be aware of if you have ABS, as this vehicle does, you'll notice when you try turning the knuckle to the side, you put stress on this connection right up here. So what you want to do is loosen these two 10mm bolts over here. If you don't have ABS, you don't have this issue. Because these sensors are very expensive. You'll see now you have a little bit more room here to move the knuckle out, so you have access to the bearing bolts. So now you want to remove all four of these 12mm bolts. Okay, now we have to press the bearing out of the knuckle. And when we do that, then the hub and rotor assembly and bearing will come off and we'll be able to finally remove the rotor. Now if you've read the Honda shop manual, they say basically remove this whole knuckle, use some special pressing adapter on a press and press the bearing out. But there's another method without removing the knuckle. To do that, buy a set of long bolts.
The bolts are M10 by 1.25 by 100mm long. M stands for metric, 10 is the diameter in millimeters, 1.25 is the thread pitch, and 100mm is the length.
I also put them in a vise and drilled a hole in the center. So basically you just want to thread these in, place the bolts you removed, you want to make sure that the threads are fully engaged, otherwise you could damage the threads in the bearing. And be very careful that you don't cross thread them. Make sure you start them by hand. You don't want to drive them all the way through either. Now, what I usually do is get my air hammer with a blunt tip, and that's the reason why I drill these holes in the tops of these bolts and go from side to side until the bearing has been pushed out. But if you don't have an air hammer, you can just as easily use a mini sledge. Just again, make sure to go from side to side. If you push it out on one side too far, it could bind up and you won't be able to push it out anymore. Pretty much got it out most of the way. Just knock it out the rest of the way with a hammer. And there it goes. And just remove the bolts and support the rotor because it will come off.
Here's the process again on the passenger side.
Finally, here's your rotor. So remove the 4 fasteners that you loosened earlier. Now you can see why I said to loosen them earlier. And the bearing and hub will come out as an assembly. Right here you can see why removing the bearing can be difficult because of all that rust in there. So before you put the new one in, you want to sand that down. Just get a little sandpaper. You don't have to get it down to clean metal by any means, but you want to remove the heavy rust deposits that'll prevent you from easily pulling the bearing back into the knuckle later. You also want to clean up the outer race of the bearing too. That's good enough.
Remove any old grease from the axle splines with a rag and some brake clean.
Remove any old residue. Also spray a little bit of brake clean on a rag. Clean the inside as much as possible. Another surface you want to clean is the surface where the hub bolts to the rotor. These flat surfaces here. So just get a little bit of sandpaper. Clean it up like that. And that's good. I'm just going to take a little bit of axle grease. Just put it on the splines.
The grease prevents the splines on the axle shaft from rusting to the splines in the hub.
Same thing on the knuckle, where the bearing's going to be pulled back in. Put a little bit of grease. Just to make it easier to pull it back in, so it doesn't bind up. Just a thin coat is all you need.
Now we can bolt the new rotor to the hub.